Good morning, everybody. I'm Miguel,
I'm EVA.
and welcome to Signals in the Noise, our daily insight into trends in Florida's narrative landscape. Signals in the Noise takes a look at news articles, social media content, and other platforms to identify conversations, messages, and stories that reinforce ideas, beliefs, and values that we interact with every day.
This allows us to identify the shape and color of how meaning is made in the landscape in which we're all organizing and communicating. This is what we call monitoring the narrative weather, and we are your resident meteorologists tracking all of it.
Yep. And each morning we'll take you through the latest, where we cover stories of importance. Then we'll move on to Hot Takes, where we look at viral content. And we'll wrap things up with On the Radar, a segment where we talk about the real time stories we're tracking. Before we get into it, welcome back, EVA. We missed you.
Thank you. I missed you guys too.
Also, just acknowledging that our other co host, Renee, is not available today, but she'll be back soon. So don't worry. All three of us will be on screen as soon as you know it.
Yep. Excited for
And with
that.
that, yeah, can't wait. And with that, let's get right into our first segment, the latest. All right, y'all. Before we get into some narrative analysis, we want to ground today in important news for all of us working on voting and elections. As of the end of the day yesterday, 46% of all registered voters in Florida have cast their ballots. That's 6.8 million ballots, passing the 6.6 ballots cast before Election Day in 2016. And we still have 6 days to go. All right, that's 6 days. Now, of course, we know that we won't likely have a definitive result on Election Day, even with all of this advanced voting, but we'll get more into that in just a minute. Let me hand this off to EVA now.
Well, calls to expand the courts, aka adding more seats to the Supreme Courts, are growing as the court is already ruling on 2020 election cases, and movement groups like Sunrise and progressive politicians like Alexandra Ocasio Cortez are leading the charge. We wanted to see how folks are talking about Amy Coney Barrett, so we went over to Reddit and dug through the SCOTUS megathread and the news subreddit.
Some of the conversations that we found include criticisms of the Senate prioritizing a SCOTUS nomination while choosing to go on recess during stimulus talks at the peak of the pandemic, calling out the hypocrisy and the rejection of Merrick Garland during the Obama administration, critiques of Trump's validators in the Senate, naming Trump's three SCOTUS appointees as tyranny by a president who lost the popular vote, and naming that elections have consequences. And that's just a sample of what we found.
Oof, that's a
These
lot.
strings of conversation, that is a lot. These strings of conversations point to a narrative thread that this election is a referendum against Trump and his validators. This is also being echoed in both the Remember in November and Vote Them Out hashtags, which we'll get more into in a few.
Our team also did some digging on the Ask a Liberal, coronavirus, lockdown skeptics, collapse, and political compass memes subreddits to get a feeling of how self ascribed non political voters were talking about the election this season and the SCOTUS nomination. While most of it was a cesspool, we spotted some nuggets. We spotted some nuggets in conversation we'd like to uplift. There are fears that Trump will use Amy Coney Barrett, or ACB, and the SCOTUS to litigate himself to a win. South Floridians are discouraged on whether their vote will count towards a progressive win because all of the pro Trump voters in the panhandle, nitpicking, and the elderly and transplants. And lastly, Trump's failure of handling the pandemic is how he handled his business poorly.
Hmm. Popular content on Facebook can be found on ABC 7 Sarasota, the Tampa Bay Times, Bay News 9, WMBB TV, and WCTV. Conversations include memes of Amy Coney Barrett as a handmaid in reference to the 1985 novel and popular Hulu series The Handmaid's Tale, questioning her experience, her support for the administration, and echoing the rights frame of the U.S. being a constitutional republic, not a democracy. On the Twitter side of things, popular content on Coney Barrett's appointment include author Don Winslow and Cenk Uygur of the Young Turks, who discussed the GOP lining up to steal the elections, especially because Supreme Court Justices Kavanaugh, Roberts, and now Barrett helped oversee the, quote, last stolen election between Bush and Gore in 2000. In addition to falsehoods on voter fraud by the right, the left and progressives are now uplifting messages that the 2020 election could play out just as it did in the year 2000, since some of the same players are involved.
The ghost of the hanging Chad will haunt us forever.
Forever.
While Remember in November is still a popular hashtag used in conversations about the election and the Supreme Court, hashtag Vote Them Out popped up after the announcement of ACB's appointment. While it's currently being used by folks all over the ideological spectrum, one of the more popular tweets in this conversation is by Senator Annette Taddeo from Miami, who went after Rick Scott's tweet about ACB's confirmation, echoing the message that instead of helping with COVID relief and being accountable for the punitive unemployment insurance he installed as governor, Scott is more preoccupied with playing partisan politics. Ouch.
Yeah. In response to today's tweet, other Twitter users used the hashtag vote them out to spread their messages, some saying the GOP should spend less time on suppressing the vote and more time suppressing, quote, Trump's virus, unquote, with the general message around voting to save Florida from politicians' tyranny and their desire to destroy democracy to serve their, quote, wealthy, polluting, greedy, corrupt overlords. Yikes.
Gosh, that's a hard one. But
Yeah.
I do wonder if the Trump virus hashtag will be making a comeback.
Honestly, the timing will be impeccable. I think there's a real opportunity to punch up the administration, though, especially after they left hundreds of people stranded in the freezing cold in Omaha. Yeah, this really happened last night.
Oh my goodness.
Anyway, with that, let's move on to our next segment, Hot Takes.
Well, Miguel, it's time to talk about your favorite topics, election security and voter protection. Are you ready?
I'm ready. What you got for me, EVA?
Well, content on smaller progressive media outlet, The Ink, discusses the election as the, quote, last exit before autocracy, unquote, with journalist Masha Gessen. In this piece, they discuss that this election season is the last time we have to block the attempt of an autocratic government by voting, that Trump is a product of an age of, quote, well-founded sense of economic and social instability, unquote, that leads to voters handing over power to a strongman figure like Trump, and that Democrats spent more time on impeachment instead of course correcting the systemic failures of institutions that made Trump possible. While the article itself isn't big in the grand scheme of things, and we haven't yet found these ideas echoed anywhere else, these ideas contest the belief that disenfranchised white working class and poor voters were single-handedly responsible for his election, and instead claim it was a response to the trauma from the aftermath of the 2008 economic crisis and subsequent recession.
Interesting. Also, the hashtag Pass It On centers conversations about election officials and election security in response to the National Vote at Home Institute thanking election officials for being the guardian angels of democracy and ensuring that every vote counts. Florida is one of several states that has ignored election security experts who advised them to remove, or at least not use, the modems in their precinct ballot scanners. Jennifer Kahn, attorney and election security advocate, helped debunk the claim that it is almost impossible to hack voting machines remotely because they're not connected to the internet. That false claim could pose a real threat to election security if voting machines are hacked.
According to the Brennan Center story on YouTube, the election management computer program designs ballots to suit memory cards before each election. And if as much as one memory card is infected, it could spread to the entire county or district. Many precinct scanners use wireless modems that connect to the county's tabulators to the internet, which makes them more prone to hacking attempts by bad actors. We tracked this story in September when election security experts sent the Secretary of State a letter to remove the modems, which she pretty much ignored. Mind you, DeSantis and the FBI confirmed that Russian hackers got into the voter databases in 2 counties in 2016 in Florida. So while it's too late to remove them, they could at least, I don't know, not use them. It's not a hard concept, really.
Listen, if all my gaming has taught me anything, is that a corrupt memory card is not a good thing.
Very true. The Sims taught me that lesson the hard way.
Yeah. In similar election security news, the concern about armed militias intimidating voters are fever pitch, as more media outlets report on vulnerability in battleground states. Some stories highlighting the concerns Black and Latinx folks have had during this year's election. There are already complex layers of narratives about safety, security, and the rule of law braided into conversations that also span issues in Florida, in this case, on how the state handles voting in a pandemic. Mm-hmm. While progressive leaders and organizations often advocate for the safety and security of Florida residents in relationship to protecting the lives of Black and Latinx people, lately around voting and pandemic protection, we see those narratives succumb to dominant and frequently contradicting narratives that state that state that the rule of law must be maintained, that individuals, not the government, are responsible for their own safety and security, except for when it comes to protecting property and the state, and that the government has the right to enforce the rule of law, even if it means infringing on individual rights and privileges. Election safety should not be limited to conversations about law and order, but instead, voter protection should be front and center as part of the democratic process.
Mhm.
Progressive messages and their validators can and should uplift demands that elected officials, need to play a role in ensuring that votes are safe that voters are safe when exercising their right to vote. Sorry.
No worries. It's really no wonder that the two-thirds of Americans fear post-election violence and riots. Based on what we've heard from folks on the ground, this fear stems from the belief that Florida voters do not think the GOP is capable of leading them through the credible, efficient, and safe election this November. Not to mention that the idea of safety is tied to the potential threat of armed militias patrolling the polls and having those militias be given the okay by Trump. This intimidation was already seeded once Trump gave the Proud Boys the order to stand back and stand by. And with their participation in pro Trump motorcades, it's hard not to believe that they might commit acts of violence that will go largely unpunished.
Right, EVA. Systemic violence is already a reality for many of our communities. Whether it's police violence or voter suppression, communities who find themselves under attack will organize because democracy is something that requires the participation of all of us. Armed militias seek to undermine our democracy. By letting fear influence the decision to sit this election out, we let them win. We need to make sure our stories, messages, ideas, and beliefs take center stage. And we need to fight against apathy and a sense of powerlessness and move people toward a vision of collective liberation. By protecting voter rights, we can protect democracy.
Very well said, Miguel. With progressive organizations creating their own task force of poll watchers in response to threats of intimidation and spreading awareness on what a person's rights are at the polls, voters continue to cast their ballots at record-breaking numbers. Stories and conversations we've seen about what this election means for democracy, can be found from validators at racial justice organizations like the NAACP, progressive media like the Young Turks, Mother Jones, or The Ink, to local stories in the Sarasota Herald Tribune, the Sun Sentinel, Channel 4 CBS Miami, and FLA Poll, to name a few. While some content asks these same difficult questions, they all discuss this election as the critical moment in this history of the United States, and questions of democracy as we know it is over. It's a little dark, but a question worth asking nonetheless. As we mentioned earlier, conversations on the right are attempting to reframe the US as not a democracy, but a constitutional republic where they assert minority rule. You want to know what else we know? Well, elected officials should be accountable to the people that vote for them. It's a crazy idea, I know. Maybe like a new idea. Who knows? Maybe no one's heard of this before. Voters can look at down ballot voting towards candidates that have their constituents' best interests in mind. Voter intimidation, suppression, disenfranchisement, and propaganda by way of disinformation have made it difficult for many who are eligible to vote to actually get to the polls. These are the existential threats we're facing today, and these are the stakes are higher when you take into consideration the pandemic, a racial uprising, ecological crisis, and a potential economic collapse.
Anything else, EVA?
I mean, if you keep scrolling, you might find some more nightmare fuel, but let's not scare our viewers anymore, okay?
Yeah. I mean, look, we know this election has been super stressful. Like, trust me, we know. Anxieties and hopelessness are at an all-time high, especially for young people, and that's just real.
Yeah.
But we cannot abandon hope. We should continue to push voters to vote early and safely. And we also need to normalize that this election is different from any we've had in history because of the pandemic. We need to allow time for every single vote to be counted accurately and completely, because every vote and the voice it represents counts, and our democracy depends on it.
True. And if voters have the ability and can do it safely, they should get to their polling location. Even if someone cannot exercise the right to vote in the election, we can affirm that they can still be politically engaged, because voting is only one small part of how we participate in making sure this democracy works for the good of the many and not the few. Mm-hmm. We can't give up, because regardless of who's sitting in the White House, there's still work that needs to be done to ensure we build a future that is accessible, equitable, and inclusive. Voting is just one piece of ensuring that that future is possible for us and for future generations. With that, let's move on to our last segment, On the Radar.
Known chaos agents at Project Veritas, not to be confused with villains in the Kingdom Hearts franchise, are attempting to uplift the false claim. Look, it sounds like it, doesn't it?
It does.
But they're attempting to uplift the false claims that there's widespread voter fraud with their hashtag rigged election. Now, for those who don't know or need a refresher, Project Veritas is an American right-wing activist group founded by provocateur James O'Keefe. The group uses hacked-together videos that are edited to create blatantly untrue stories to reveal supposed liberal bias and corruption. And it is known for producing deceptively edited videos about media organizations and left-leaning groups, namely Planned Parenthood and Acorn. These deceptive videos often spread across audiences and into the mainstream.
You ever think about how saying something out loud gives it life? Well, I think that we were having a conversation some weeks ago about O'Keefe, and here they are trying to fabricate falsehoods about a canvasser in Texas. We know Twitter is on top of their inoculation response and are trying to suppress the spread of the hashtag and any content by O'Keefe.
Look, I got 3 words for Twitter: suspend the account.
Right, it's really that simple. Also, we're paying attention to other platforms who fall short in their inoculation response, like YouTube. And they think about their role in the current media ecosystem, especially as it calls for tech accountability grow louder and louder and louder as the days pass.
We're also monitoring stories on Brett Kavanaugh's alleged plan to help Trump steal the election, as reported by Mother Jones on October 27th. Mm-hmm. And because it's so close to the election, we'll definitely continue to keep our ears on the ground. So if you watching have any questions, spot any disinformation, or want us to focus on a specific topic in our research, feel free to send us a message at tipline@thisissignals.com. All right, EVA, that's all for us this morning. Thanks so much for coming back. We missed you. We really did.
I'm happy to be back. I'll see everyone tomorrow. Bye, y'all.
All right. Bye.